Okay, I think we are live and recording, and I have 6 o'clock. I have no gavel, so I'll just bang on the table and call this regular meeting of the Loveland Board of Education for the purpose of a work session to order at 6 o'clock p.m. and ask Mr. Hawley for a roll call.
Mr. Doherty?
Here.
Dr. Lorenz?
Here.
Ms. Pettit?
Ms. Pettit will be late.
Dr. Switchina?
Here.
Mrs. Washburn?
Here. 4 board members are present. And if we could have a motion to adopt the agenda for this evening.
So moved.
Mr. Doherty moved and Mrs. Washburn seconded. You have a copy of the agenda at your table. You had a copy on board docs. Any question or discussion about the agenda? All right, Mr. Hawley, can we vote on that?
Dr. Lorenz?
Yes.
Dr. Switchina?
Yes.
Mrs. Washburn?
Yes.
Mr. Doherty?
Yes.
Motion carried. Before we get started on the agenda, I will make note of the fact that we have in the Loveland Middle School Media Center, Intermediate Middle School Media Center. We have 4 board members present. As I said, Ms. Pettit hopes to arrive later. We have our superintendent, Mr. Nevin, our treasurer, Mr. Hawley. We have our new and once and future superintendent, Mike Broadwater, with us. We have some administrators with us, Mr. Collier, Mr. Ogden, Ms. Connor. And we have some folks who are going to be doing some presenting for us. We have Felice and Pam Ringberg with us, just for the audience who are listening to us online. I would ask the board at this point if they are comfortable doing the meeting without masks this evening in light of the fact that the governor has, excuse me while you put your mask on. I believe that we can be distanced here in this room. We do not have any audience. And so if it's okay with the board, and since one of the first things we're going to be doing is discussing the mask policy, I guess it looks like it's okay with the board since I see that masks have disappeared already. Is it all right if we remove our masks for this evening? It is still officially a policy of the Loveland School District that in school buildings we would wear masks. Since we do not have students in the building, and again, since the governor has relaxed those mandates, we will proceed without masks. It feels a little weird to be having a meeting without masks. And we'll move into the first item on the agenda, which is board discussion. It says board discussion. It's concerning masks and revisions to policy 8450.01. I am going to turn the floor first over to Mr. Nevin and let him introduce what information he has for us this evening, and then we'll get started on our discussion.
Great. As promised, we do have a presentation tonight about our current health statistics, kind of how we finished the year up. We have our school nurse, Judy Leamy, and her husband, Kevin, here to provide us with updates on the statistics of the health of our students over the last year. As you know, they've both been highly engaged and very involved and very helpful as we've moved through this pandemic process. So I'll turn it over to you folks.
Good evening all.
Okay, good evening all. I'm Judy Leamy. I'm one of the district nurses in Loveland, and I'm here today as a representative of the COVID health team. We have been meeting weekly for nearly a year to help navigate the ever-changing landscape of all things related to COVID as it applies to Loveland schools, and act as liaisons between Hamilton County Health Department response teams and the district. We have worked closely with Hamilton County as well as Children's Hospital to help keep staff, students, and our families safe during this unique time. Our goal in this presentation this evening is to share data about other unanticipated health outcomes we have seen by putting in the mitigation measures we use to address COVID. I'm going to turn this over to Kevin Leamy, another member of the COVID health team.
Hello, everyone. Hey, just a little background. I am not a public health, specialist. I retired from GE Aviation in May of 2020. Here's a tip for you. You should probably not retire in a pandemic. it's probably not the best thing. And my role here was, first it started off as Judy asked me, hey, can you help install a few hand sanitizers? And it seemed like hundreds of hand sanitizers later, and then it was building some plexiglass barriers. But eventually there was a job posting to support the COVID team. Basically, my role was to synthesize the data and submit it to Hamilton County Public Health. So, one of the things that was anecdotal observation during the year from the people in the clinic and the nurses was that, hey, they weren't really seeing the kids in the clinic. They were not really seeing, illnesses in the clinic. And so we wanted to quantify that data. So so that's one of the things, I was tasked to do. So when a student enters the clinic, it gets logged in the DAZZLE system, which is the school database system. There's three basic categories. There's the reason they came in, there's the type of care they get. The reason can be, hey, my nose is bleeding, I got a headache, whatever. And then the type of care could be a Band-Aid, applying heat, ice, rest, whatever. And then there's a disposition, whether they call 911 or whether they send the child home or back to the classroom. Anyway, there's about a dozen of categories within each of those topics. So I basically pulled data from the last 3 years from the DAZZLE system. This is all in the health log data. So I compared school year 18-19, full school year, and then I compared 19-20. Remember, we were shut down from, I'll say, the end of March through the rest of the year. And then 2021. So actually Loveland did such a good job. We were in hybrid in the beginning of the year, and then just a little bit in January. So I took those 3 years of data and I corrected the data a little bit. For example, the 18-19 school year, no correction, full school year, right? But because of 19-20, we were remote, I basically scaled that data, the health log data, up by 1/3 to be conservative. Similar kind of factor was applied to the 2021 school year. Again, I increased it by 20% just because there were not as many kids in the school. So basically, I pulled all this data. I kind of correlated it based on, the health reasons, the type of care. And, over on the right-hand side is the plot of just kind of the raw data. And you can see it's based for each building and then for the 3 school years. And actually, I was quite surprised by the number of health-related events here. And you can see that there was a significant reduction for the 2021 school year. Basically, we saw about a 2.7 factor reduction in overall events. You can see kind of the sub reductions in illnesses, injuries. I put lice in there. It's a relatively small number, but it kind of has the ick factor in it, where basically there was just onesie twosies this year. Previously, there had been, I'll say, dozens. There was no observed influenza symptoms. The number of calls to have parents come and pick children up was reduced by nearly a factor of 2.
If I could just make a comment for anyone who is watching, we do not have this on the screen right now. It is available in board docs. So anyone watching could access it in the board docs agenda. And we will place it. It will be available in the minutes after the meeting is over.
So that was the basic, I'll say, assessment from the health log data. We also looked at to see if there was a impact on average attendance. And this is probably the softest number in the presentation. I looked at only February of the 3 years because they were the only years where we had mitigation in place. And, the previous year in 1920, it's right before the pandemic started. And then obviously 18-19 was a full school year. There is a second page of this, and it kind of shows just the average attendance per building, and it looked like it had increased about 2%. So, you'd need to really do a little bit more analysis on this, but for, the month we looked at, this kind of, I'll say, is consistent with, again, some of the anecdotal data that the teachers were saying. It seemed like there were more kids in school, they weren't getting sick. So really, because of these positive benefits of the COVID protocols on other health issues, some of the mitigations will be retained, right? I'll call it modified bundling, where we're trying to keep some distance, we're hand washing. There were traffic flows that were set up in the building. There were certain processes for arrival and dismissal of the buses. If you walk by the lunchroom, there was still plexiglass up there, but there was separation. Lunch was always a very, I'll say, vulnerable spot because of masks were off, kids were eating, talking, etc. The custodial cleaning, teacher cleaning, that should be maintained. Things to maintain airflow, online meetings. If you're going to have large gatherings, you should consider the risks associated with those. And I guess relative to the operation of the clinics themselves, they did limit the number of students in the clinic. When they come down there, they are sick, so that had a benefit. There was some basic aid that was being done within the classroom, and that before students were sent down, they were calling the clinic. So those things, I'll say, were more operational in terms of helping to contribute to this reduction in other health effects. I think the other thing that we were looking at, and Brad, I don't know if you want to jump in here, but other things that we were considering that is that perhaps targeted masking. For example, if we observe absentee rates going up, would we, because of flu or something like that, would we want to recommend masking? That might be one thing. Another thing that I'll say recommend is if you have unvaccinated volunteers or visitors coming in, you might recommend that they be masked. Now, I guess this is up for discussion on the board on how you want to implement those kind of things. But anyway, this is kind of the overall statistics that we observed. Actually, they were, again, quite surprising. There were significant reductions, across each of the buildings. And in fact, each of the building administrators were kind of given their own set of results. So that's really all I have to say. Any questions?
I can pitch in, and I just want to add, thank you so much for putting that together. It's one of the things that I've been pestering us for all year. Is like, what do our numbers look like this year, and what have they looked like in previous years? And obviously, you can't put that together until the end of the year with any reliability. I think that the number for attendance is actually much more impressive than it sounds. When you phrase it as February average attendance improved by 2%, the reality, when you look at the number, is there was a 20 to 30% decrease in the number of kids who were absent in the month of February. It's a tremendous decrease by instituting all of those measures. So great work and good job collecting all the data for us.
Okay, you're welcome. Yep.
So, the medical piece of it, that we're really talking about mainly the other health related, the unanticipated things. And, and so those recommendations are something that we wanted you all to say, yeah, we would like to continue with those type of things, going forward to prevent that, kind of thing. So.
Well, I feel strongly we should continue with these protocols, kind of the modified bundles we talked about. And obviously, you know, our health team has made some recommendations on masking. The policy reflects that we should continue on with those protocols, but also kind of leaves the masking choice up to the parents and the guardians, because we feel that this is a point in time where they should make those choices. So I do have that policy for you to take a look at this evening. And I just want to say again, as I said last month, this has been a great conversation with parents on both sides of the issue. We've had really rich dialogues. It's just people who care about their kids and really want to do what they feel is best for them. They've been highly engaged, very respectful. And really, I would just say to the community, this is the way the process works. You know, when we get people involved and can give us good feedback, good guidance, then we can wrestle with it as an administrative team and take it to the board to make good recommendations. So kudos and thank you. We do have, actually, I think we have 2 drafts of the policy. Dr. Swetchenow made some changes. Nothing to really substantive, but just some changes in wording. And obviously, I'm going to defer to his medical expertise at this point.
For whatever that might be. Thanks, and thank you for the help in trying to put language together for us for as far as going forwards in policy. Before we kind of dive into that policy itself, I kind of wrote a quick statement about, you know, where we've been and where we're going and how do we get there safely and how do we keep our community healthy. And I started with, wow, what a year. You know, it's certainly nothing like we've ever seen before. You know, as everybody knows by now, the state of Ohio has lifted all COVID-related mandates as of yesterday, June 2nd. This included the end of the state's masking and distancing requirements for K through 12 schools. If the proposed update for policy 8450-01 is passed this evening, the wearing of masks for all school-related events such as summer school classes, athletic activities, summer camps will be optional. From the very beginning of this school year, we followed the state requirements regarding COVID protocols and will continue to do so moving forwards. Many families have had questions regarding returning to school in August, and that's obviously on the forefront of everybody's mind at this point. It's obviously also a few months from now. Should the current situation remain in effect, masks will indeed be optional upon return to school. I personally can't stress enough how happy I am to see the spirit of our community, most particularly that of our students and teachers. They responded to the challenges of an unprecedented year with incredible grace and strength on a day-to-day basis, living with this new environment. 2 weeks to stop the spread, which was the mantra in the early spring, became 15 months of COVID-related restrictions to preserve the health and safety of our community. We rose to that challenge and provided in-school 5-day-a-week learning for our youngest students just over 1 month after the start date of our scheduled school year. Despite an incredible amount at that time of uncertainty, fear, and personal risk on the part of our staff. Our teachers showed incredible courage and flexibility while tackling a never before contemplated hybrid model. Our high school teachers managed to teach a full curricular year, even with half of their students virtual and half in person, using classroom-based camera technology, despite no previous experience or training in the use of those techniques. I liken this to me explaining to a resident in another room how to do a surgery while I was on the telephone. It's pretty amazing to think about it. Challenges of mandated quarantine restrictions for exposed high school students meant that in a full capacity model, for every 1 case of COVID, up to 20 students would have been forced to quarantine away from school for 2 weeks. Our state and our schools came together with an incredible show of cohesiveness in a very divided time. And they gathered data showing that with mask wearing, social distancing, and increased hygiene measures, that students could safely be spaced more closely in classes and not be at risk for contracting or spreading COVID. This allowed our high school to return to full capacity in 2021, even with the limitations of our physical plant, while avoiding the onerous and incredibly disruptive quarantines that affected so many of our neighboring districts. That being said, we definitely face further challenges. This pandemic is on the wane, but it's not over. We know that coronaviruses are seasonal. We know that there's a high risk of increased cases again in the late fall and winter. We know that viruses mutate. We know that with ongoing global spread, that there's a chance that our current vaccines will no longer be effective in the future. We know that vaccination is currently almost universally successful in preventing severe COVID infections. We know that vaccination greatly cuts down on the likelihood of even mild breakthrough cases. We know that children as young as age 12 have the ability to be safely vaccinated, and that this dramatically decreases their ability to further onward spread COVID. We know that children younger than 12 are incredibly resilient when infected. The vast majority has only mild symptoms even when ill. We know that young children spread COVID at a significantly lower rate than adolescents and adults. These facts all generally bode well for our students and schools in the upcoming year, but we must remain vigilant. We must continue to stress to our families that sending children, particularly those who are unvaccinated, to school with colds and cold symptoms puts others at risk in a way that has never before happened. We must be able to provide a safe environment for all members of our community. We need to maximize our physical plant to allow ventilation and airflow to naturally decrease risk. We have to have the ability to better determine who does and doesn't need to be quarantined or further tested when showing signs of illness. We have many challenges in front of us until this pandemic is truly over. I look forward to participating with our steadfast and dedicated administrative and teaching teams to help to guide our Tiger families to a safe, healthy, exciting, informative, and fun, please bring back the fun, school year. So I wanted to say thank you again for all of the teachers and staff. It was a ridiculous year to have to live through, and you did a tremendous job. Brad had sent out a copy of a proposed revision, and I had some just really mild changes that I took the time to print out, so I'll pass out.
Before we discuss the policy, I just wanted to mention and thank all those who had, I'd like to summarize for the board the input that we've gotten from our community. As you all know, we had some input at our last meeting, and we have had some emails. By my count, we've had a half a dozen individuals email us concerning the desire to have the mask mandate lifted. We've also had a couple of emails reminding us of the benefits that some parents have seen from the masking, and thanking us for the care that we've shown for our students by having individuals masked in the building. So I just wanted to summarize that communication that we've gotten. I also wanted to mention that generally, when we adopt policies, we follow a procedure of 2 readings of the policies. This is not required in our policy on adopting policies, which we jokingly talk about sometimes, but we do have a policy about policies. But 2 readings are not required, but we generally follow that procedure. The reason for that is it gives both board members who want to review the policy and make suggestions for changes, the chance to do so and have all board members see those changes. It also allows the public to see that at the first meeting, the first reading, and then they have an opportunity to submit suggestions or questions about the policy before it's adopted at its second reading. Because of the mandate being lifted just yesterday, and because of summer school things coming up, and because also the public wanting to know, we are going to try this evening to revise this policy. Board members have a copy of the current policy that's in hand. They have a possible revised policy, and then they have a possible revised policy. And so we're going to try and have a discussion about that. 2 of those copies are on board docs. The current policy is on board docs. The proposed revision is on there. I don't believe that the changes that Dr. Swetchnow is going to discuss are on board docs, but as Mr. Nevin mentioned, they're not appreciably different than the one that is on there. And obviously, if we are able to discuss this and adopt this policy this evening, the adopted policy will be immediately sent to Neola, who puts it into our system, and then it will appear in our policies, but it would go into effect this evening. So now, discussion of the revision to the policy.
I am so glad you're in charge of policy. Yeah, the revisions I made really were very mild. It involved kind of flipping some paragraphs around, just kind of what the recent history is and why this is being done now. And then just a couple of things that we had put in August that I don't think are really applicable now. One of them was I redlined federal government and Centers for Disease Control, as the federal government isn't really giving us any mandates or requirements, but rather just guidance. So our I guess, controlling bodies, the way that I understand them, are the governor, the state health department, the Hamilton County Health Department, and the Ohio Department of Education. There was other language that said in other entities, which I felt was broad and didn't really necessarily explain anything. So I recommended taking that out. And then one of them just said, if any of these directing entities or district administration requires staff, students, and visitors to wear face coverings, I had crossed out district administration, and I wanted to have a conversation about that. I do like our administration having the flexibility to institute these things, but with something like this, I'd like to have some level of discussion before that happened. So that's why I'd recommended just crossing out district administration. Otherwise, it was really just moving 2 paragraphs up forwards. Go ahead.
And Eric and Brad, I was just going to say there's actually twice as many people online than we have in the room. And in the conversation, it might be helpful to everybody to, at some point, summarize what the policy is actually going to do.
Can I withdraw my draft because I like his better?
The only reason to reference your draft is that it is in essence saying what Dr. Swetchnow's
Sure.
proposal is, so that people who are listening online can see it on board docs. He's made some revisions, which I think he's spoken eloquently to, but the gist of the revision remains what the proposed policy looks like. And that is that the masking would be where's the wording of it? That masking, I can't find it now. The choice to mask will be left to adult individuals and parents and guardians of K-12 students.
Correct. So essentially, I took the policy that was implemented back in August of last year and removed some of the language that wasn't pertinent, and Dr. Swetchnow removed a little bit more, but also essentially said we maintain the same protocols, we recommend these protocols, but just on the actual mask, because the governor has basically kicked the decision out to school districts to say that the school district will leave that decision to the parents and the guardians. So we're not going to go above and beyond what the governor says, and certainly not take away the parents' right to make their decisions.
Any other discussion, board members?
I do have one discussion point, which went back to our health team's presentation, which is, I do believe that we're going to have to face additional mandates at some point. It's unlikely that nothing stays the rule of thumb, but it's hard to know what will happen in the future. I do think this, especially the suggestion about if you're having visitors who are unvaccinated, do we ask them to wear masks as they come into the school buildings, is an important conversation to have. And I don't know that we necessarily have to have that conversation right now or in policy, as it may become moot in the future, but it certainly is a really valuable point that mitigating risk is identifying your areas of highest risk and trying to lower those.
Yeah, I wish there was just an easy one-size-fits-all answer, but as we all know, there isn't. With that being said, I do like Eric's revisions and the flipping of paragraphs and the exclusion of certain entities on here in the wording.
I saw that Mrs. Leamy had a question. Is that correct? Correct.
One of my I just want to make sure when we're just have these discussions, the health team, I mean, the policy that you're talking about, we were talking about the other health related things, not COVID, in terms of the targeted masking. We still recommend that masking, masking, especially of unvaccinated people, is, important. Like that's what we recommend as the health team. But we also want people to be aware of the implications for quarantine, and which I think you were speaking to, Dr. Swetchenow, of, if we have a positive case, we still have to follow. It is a Class A reportable illness, and we're still going to have to follow the protocols that we had last year, which at different times of the year were significant. And then, of course, what you discussed about, the relaxing of the social distancing, the mask wearing, decrease the quarantines and stuff. So if we have a student who is positive, I just want people to be, know all the information and not think, woohoo, we don't have to worry about reporting diseases or anything. We are still required by the state of Ohio to report. It's what they call a Class A reportable disease to the health department. The health department is still going to require us to then contact trace, and not they do the contact tracing, but we identify who was within 6 feet for greater than 15 minutes, as we did last year. We're still going to need to do those type of things. And so if you're in an unmasked environment, or if that's the way the direction that we're going, then those kids can get caught up in those quarantines and stuff. So that's one of the things that we saw the big difference between, and of course with the spread being down and everything, that could, many factors come into it. And I think that's what Dr. Schwarzenau was saying is, hey, there are a lot of good news here, but there's a lot of news that people got to recognize when they get that phone call, which is, and I think people in this room can share how difficult it is to call people and say, your child's going to be home for 10 days and you have to get COVID tested to be out of a quarantine or any of those type of things. And currently we've only been quarantining kids from the cafeteria because that was the only time they were unmasked. If they're unmasked in a room, we're going to have to be working with Hamilton County because there's going to be more kids caught up in that. So I just want to make sure that
and I
that
just
is
wanted
clear.
to add one thing. That was a perfect summary, and you're absolutely right. Just because masks go away doesn't mean all of those health department rules go away. There has been a change, and there will likely be a change regarding if somebody is vaccinated and they've been exposed to somebody with COVID. So unvaccinated, unmasked has the highest risk of being asked to leave school. Vaccinated, masked has the lowest risk.
Yeah, if you're vaccinated, you do not have to quarantine, kind of thing, if you don't have symptoms.
So are all Class A reportable diseases required to quarantine, like other things outside of COVID, or is it?
It just depends on the
COVID?
disease. You know what I mean? With COVID, that is the protocol. And we report to Hamilton County, and so we have to report those illnesses. But that is not, I don't know for every single Class A reportable. It's going to be very different for each one of them, what the protocol is.
I agree that that's good information, and I think it bears publishing as we move through the summer and get into the fall. It does not, I don't believe, need to be in this policy, use of face coverings, because that's purely what we're talking about here. But we do have in the policy that we will continue to follow the COVID-19 mitigation protocols. But I do think that that's very worth publishing as we move along so that parents do know exactly what is going to cause the quarantine to come into effect. There was one other thing that you mentioned, and now it's gone. It'll come to me after, but no, that's okay. There was another thing that Judy mentioned that I wanted to talk about. But I don't think that the quarantining piece needs to go into this policy.
It seems, as you're saying, what we're talking about right now is mask policy. What we heard about just prior to and is up on board docs in terms of health events really is talking primarily about non-masking mitigation strategies. Not that it totally eliminates masking, But there's a whole bunch of things that are discussed here with kind of very impressive results that it would seem to me would make sense to revisit prior to the start of the school year, because we'll have a fresh look at the community and the state of whatever is going on health-wise, and we could have a better informed conversation at that point.
I remembered what I was going to mention, and that was the notion of putting anything about unvaccinated visitors works. We couldn't put anything in this policy about those who are unvaccinated because currently a lot of our school population is under the age of 12 and would not be able to be vaccinated at this point. So we have a lot of unvaccinated people that are going to be governed by this policy. So we would need to be very careful what we put in the policy about unvaccinated people in the schools.
No, I agree completely. And it is, well, it is and will remain a challenge to have people self-report statuses in order to treat them differentially, which I have a lot of concerns about social liberty with that kind of question. But nonetheless, it's an important public health question.
You know, we've been doing this. We're now doing what school nurses have preached to us for years about these protocols, except for the masks and the screens between kids. It's not new for us to have to call a parent and say, keep your child at home. If we have a child with a fever, we've sent them home. We've done that for a long time. This is the first time, though, that we've had the data points to really show that these mitigation efforts that Judy's preached about for a long time actually do work. And that's for all health conditions. So again, you know, it puts it back on, just like in the past when we would give recommendations to parents and say, if your child's sick, keep them home. And it's obviously an inconvenience for parents at times. They might say, well, it's just the sniffles. But now parents have, I think, a different perspective. I think we're better educated as a society. And now they'll make those choices. I anticipate great things. I do think we should continue to post our recommendations out there as we've done. Again, it just comes down to that decision to wear that mask or not. We're giving back to the parents.
Anything else?
We just have to make a decision about which version that we're running with, right?
Not quite that easy. Kathy has some words. You know how Kathy is with words. I just have a couple of quick suggestions. I am going from Eric's proposed revised. And in the third paragraph, it starts as of today's adoption of this updated policy. And I would simply change that to read as of the revision date or the adoption date. I guess as of the adoption date, June 3rd, 2021 of this policy. So that it's, I realize that's repetition, but I think it makes it clear. As of the adoption date, June 3rd, 2021 of this policy, comma, unless required. It makes it very clear what we're talking about when we're talking about making this change. And then in the last paragraph, the sentence that starts with if, I would change that if to when. When any of these directing entities requires staff and visitors to wear face coverings while attending school, the district will follow and enforce such directives. I think that makes it clearer than if, and then people don't have to know. I mean, we would have to know when they require it, and that's when it would happen. So I would propose those friendly amendments to Dr. Swetchnow's friendly amended policy.
You have those notes in your copy there?
I do.
I'll make sure that I have those accurate and get those changed.
Anything else? Any other words we missed?
Is it beneficial to keep what the revision you said with as of today's adoption? Or could we just start with unless required by additional mandates? Or do we need the other in there as a reference point of timing?
It seems to me that it can't hurt. It's a repetition. It's a redundancy. The policy becomes effective when we adopt it. But I think this is a policy that there are some policies that people never refer to. They just, they're just there. This one would be referred to, and I don't think it hurts to make it extra clear when it was revised.
Okay, doesn't hurt anything to have it in there.
I don't think so. Because if we make any changes to the policy, then we'll revise it again and we'll have a different revision date. Anything else? All right, I will make sure that Mr. Nevin has those. And as I mentioned, the procedure for our policy, if the board adopts this, is that the actual copy needs to go to Neola, our policy consultant company. They are the ones who actually enter it into the system. They do this so that they can guarantee that they have in the system the most updated. If we just start adding things here and there, they don't necessarily get it updated in the master one. So it may take a little bit of time for that to happen, but the policy would go into effect tonight if we adopt it. If that's all we have on that policy, the next thing on our agenda is to approve revision to policy 8450.01, use of face covering masks. Is there a motion? Mrs. Washburn moved and Mr. Doherty seconded. And that again is that revised version that is not currently on board docs. We'll see if we can't get that onto board docs right away in the agenda in the minutes, but it will take a little bit of time to get onto the Neola policy site. Any questions or discussion about the motion? Mr. Hawley, can we vote?
Dr. Switchnow?
Yes.
Mrs. Washburn?
Yes.
Mr. Doherty?
Yes.
Dr. Lorenz?
Yes, motion carried. Now I think we're going to let Mr. Nevin make some more report
Okay.
on something else.
You'll notice that on the agenda, I have attached the proposal for the mobile units. And this is information that I provided to you in my weekly update, comes directly from John Ames. Mr. Ames isn't able to be here this evening. We do have the need for 2 mobile units on the LPS campus. If you look through the proposals, he gives descriptions about EMOD seems to be the leading candidate. There are differences in price. You'll see a 24 by 50 and a 24 by 40. So you see the differences there. Couple of just notes on this. Says the Will Scott Vesta units have been utilized at other schools and will be refurbished for use, whereas the EMOD units are brand new. Will Scott does not perform any installation functions, which means the district will be required to contract and manage these functions from a local vendor if possible. Vesta performs all installation functions except for providing the technology company cabling, and EMOD also performs all installation functions, including electrical tie-in, fire alarm, and technology cabling. So as Mr. Ames and I talked, obviously you can see where the prices are, and EMOD is very competitive. But as he and I talked, he does have some pretty significant concerns about trying to find a local vendor to be able to do the installation for us, given kind of where contracting is at this point in time. Any questions about those units at this point?
Brad, I'm very comfortable that John will look out for fiscal health and making the right decision. And I think what you're asking for here, or what he's asking for, is without making a determination of the supplier to give him to go ahead to do this.
Correct.
Yeah, I just note that there's a lot of apples and oranges mixed in here, you know, some with installation, some without, different size units, et cetera. And if you looked at it on a square footage basis, the EMODs were by far the most expensive, but that may be offset by some of the installation services. I just want to be transparent about this, that it's hard to assess who we should go with, but B, and I've worked with John enough to know that he looks at everything, and I would imagine he'll do that. You're assuring us that he will do that as we go through this.
He and I share the same concern also with used units, although they are refurbished. You all know that these depreciate relatively quickly, obviously, compared to a building. So I don't anticipate that the cost savings of going to the used units would really be there, especially in light of the fact that we'd likely have to find other contractors to come in. So I appreciate your comments. Anything else?
I would just add one more thing. As I read it, the EMOD units are the only ones that we're purchasing. The other ones are 5-year leases, and the projected time of use would be 7 to 10 years.
Correct.
So our costs going with the leased units could be significantly higher than
Could be.
projected in this.
Correct.
And I echo what Kevin said. John's been doing this for a long time and knows what he's doing.
Sure. Anything else?
So what you need from the board this evening is simply an agreement that we have heard this information.
Correct.
There's not a board resolution that's needed this evening. We'll just move forward.
Correct. We need.
Or Mr. Ames will move forward.
Correct. Yeah. And we, obviously we're under a time crunch, but the fact that, you know, if he goes with the MOD, obviously there's a better opportunity to get these in a significant or a sooner time frame since they do the full installation. So just another comment on staffing goals, and basically saying the same thing I did last year, but I do, or last month, but I do want you to know that as we work through our staffing, you know, as I said last month, our goal is to provide the optimum education we can for our students, and certainly within the boundaries of our financial resources. Just kind of as a brief update, I want the board to know our staffing costs are tracking for next year at a projected savings over this year. I hesitate to give those numbers because we're still in the hiring season, but as it looks right now, kudos to our HR team and to our staff. It looks like we'll have some pretty significant savings as we move into staffing and still provide exceptional education for our students. I do have several policies that we'll have for first reading or approval in June at the business meeting, depending on the urgency of their passage in response to legislation, et cetera. As you all know, we have some policies out there. I've also engaged our policy consultant from Neola to conduct an audit of our policies. One of the gifts that I would like to give to our new superintendent is that we have a good process in place for our policies to get those updated. And I think once we get the audit done, we can get things cleaned up pretty quickly. I anticipate the audit will take 2 to 4 weeks. So after this discussion tonight, I'll go back to Tom Dunn, our consultant, and get things going. Have a couple of comments on communications.
Mr. Nevin,
Yes.
do you have an approximate cost on that audit? What it would add?
It's less
to
than
the-
$3,000.
Thank you.
So on the, an update on communications, you know, we've all talked about this quite a bit, about the board working hard to develop better communications plans. In your notes, you'll find board policy 9120.01, which is your current policy on school community relations goals. I say to folks, the fact that it says relations rather than engagement dates itself. You know, we tend to talk more in terms of engagement, meaning that the stakeholders have an interest, and therefore we want to make sure they're at the table talking with us. I would say that the list of goals is generally good and broadly encompasses what a school district should be doing. However, this policy was adopted in 1999. And just to give you a little bit of reference in the world of communications, in 1999, Facebook was only 5 years old, and MySpace was 4 years from being launched. Twitter was 7 years from being hatched, and so was LinkedIn. YouTube was founded in 2007, and the hashtag arrived. Instagram was released in 2010, the year we started widely using pre-designed emojis. And all of these platforms are now widely used on the iPhone that was released 8 years after the last school community relations policy was updated. And I don't say that to give you all a finger wag. I say that to say this is consistent with what I've seen in other school districts. I heard a expert in the field of technology say it only took schools 20 years to get the overhead projector out of the bowling alley and into the classrooms. So I think it's time for us to consider this. Again, it has some really good goals, but I think it's important for us to come together and see how we can tweak those goals and obviously make them more responsive to our current community and how they communicate at this time. So I'm asking the board for the permission to begin the effort engaging our in-house team and the planning commission, the communications team, to start to talk about this policy and about how we move forward. I've spoken individually, I think, with all of you about our need to really up our communications game. And as part of that process, I'm also at our next meeting going to be requesting that we have an approval for an agreement to extend and expand our agreement with the Hamilton County ESC for communication services. Currently, we have Andrew Setters in our district 2 to 3 days a week. I'm going to be requesting that we expand to 5 days per week and that we move for a 1-year contract. It's my recommendation at this point in time to continue to contract those services out, although at the end of the day, the cost may be about the same versus hiring the person in. But I think as we develop this entire communication strategy, rather than commit to one particular model. Let's see how this shakes out. But I will tell you this, in my years of experience, if Andrew is not at the top, he is the top of people in this realm. And the reason I say that is a lot of folks look at communications as Facebook, Twitter, and those things that I mentioned. As a superintendent with a lot of years of experience, I want a communications director that can help me with the message. In a time of crisis, I don't need someone who knows how to post on Facebook. What I need is someone who can help me to craft the message to best get the information out to the parents in the community. And Andrew has proven himself in that regard. So I think we're blessed to have him. I want you to know that I have talked to Mike Broadwater. Mike interviewed him today. I called it an interview. We had a good discussion. And you want to give us the thumbs up?
I'm very impressed with Andrew. I'm working with him a little bit prior, and I don't think you're going to find anybody better in terms of communication and getting out the information our community would like to know. So I agree.
And I want to be clear, any step that I take in this process, or pretty much any process, I'll have Mr. Broadwater involved, as far as just kind of getting things moving in the right direction so that he has one less door to open when he comes in, because he'll have plenty to keep him busy for sure. So
I would just make one comment as you move into this evaluation and moving forward. There is, I know, a packet of Neola policies regarding social media that we have not yet adopted. I'm not sure that most school districts have. Neola's caution with them was that some of it has to do with the legalities of keeping information, of dealing legally with information. So it's not pertinent necessarily to our communications plan, but there may be some useful information in those policies as to what could be referenced in a communications plan as far as use of social media and how to make sure that the district uses it in a responsible and legal way. So I know those exist. I know the policy committee was getting their feet wet trying to get those done, and then we've put a lot of policy on hold. But again, I know lots of districts were doing that, putting that on hold. So
Brad, you and I had a lot of conversation about this, and I'm sure there's going to be a lot more going down the road. Thank you for pulling this policy out. I hadn't read this one actually before, and while it is certainly technique and tool completely out of date, I think from a messaging perspective, there's very little that you'd want to delete from this. And that's kind of interesting for a 20-plus-year-old policy where it talks about it, the school community relations program being planned, systematic, two-way process. It is at least thinking about using media sources, should promote involvement, objective appraisal, and support factual, objective, realistic data, be responsive both to events as they arise and to evaluations of the program, et cetera. So there are themes in there that I think we would all still agree to. The thing for me, and I know some other board members have strong feelings about this as well, but I believe that we need to be far more proactive in our communications with the community. I use the term candor or candid a lot. I think we need to figure out how to improve the degree of candor that the district in total displays in its interactions with the community. That's a little rough coming out of some of the history that's more of recent times, but it's important for both. Well, it's important for everybody. I think to talk plainly and when we can talk as quickly about issues of the day. So I support what you're trying to do here. I do think that the Planning Commission has done a lot of work in this area, and leaning on them and Andrew and other folks, I think is very much the right thing to do. I would like to, at some point when you're ready, have a discussion about what the plan we think will be. I think we need to have that here. So, thank you.
Well, and I can add in a little bit. I'm sorry, Eileen, go ahead.
No, it's okay.
I can add in a little bit to that, which is when Kevin and I started, which was just less than a year ago, one of the things that we felt very strongly about was containing our costs and containing the growth of our costs. And one of the byproducts of that was that our communications manager was leaving and that position wasn't filled. And we filled it with a part-time person, and Andrew's done a tremendous job at 2 days a week. But we've seen very clearly that we haven't been able to get traction with what we really need, which is communicating with our community and reaching out to people and getting a strategy to make sure that all of the decisions that were made are broadcast loudly and clearly. And I've even found it funny that we've gotten complaints about our lack of communication by the same people who asked us to keep the costs low by not hiring a communications person. So I'm fully supportive after being here for almost a year of realizing how valuable that position is and how much we need a full-time person. And I think Andrew's tremendous.
You know, the comment I made,
I said this to Kevin today. I had this reflection at one point. I said, you fired the fireman in the middle of the fire. And I understand the opportunity to save some dollars, but I always caution folks on inexpensive or cost savings versus cheap. And if you try to, and not to point fingers or darts to anybody, but I understand it. But unfortunately, what happens is then you have a lack of communications out there, lack of authentic communications. And very clearly what I've heard throughout these coffees is we need more communications, and also we want communications the way we consume them, which agreed, when you look at your old policy and it talks about the media at that point in time was still print news, and largely print news and the local TV stations. You know, that's back in the day when we used to have to call up a company and say, we have a snow day today, versus now parents opting in. I want an email, I want a tweet, so there's a lot to wrestle with here, but I do think that we have things in place to get this moving forward.
See, one of the challenges there is that, you could argue if you were effectively using the media of yesteryear, your reach was further than our email reach is today, because our email database is basically parents and a very tight school community, which is, a quarter maybe of the community. So one of the key things that has to be, I think, dealt with here is not just the message, whatever that message needs to be on a day-to-day basis, but how do we actually get it into people's hands? So that's been a frustration I think we've all had for a long time now.
So it's kind of a war story, if you can allow it. It's a good story though. So when I became a superintendent, we didn't have a one-call system. We actually had the phone chain, and we had to call the news media, which meant someone's waiting to put their child on the bus out in the country, and they're watching the news, and it's scrolling and scrolling and scrolling. And if you didn't get your name, Eaton, where I was, if you didn't get it in quite on time, they scrolled all the way through all the Saints, and then had to come back to Eaton. So you roll the tape a few years later. I was actually a high school principal when this happened. And I get a call from the superintendent that said, I'm thinking about shutting school down at 1 o'clock. And I went to the teachers and I said, hey, be prepared. We may be shutting down school at 1 o'clock. And the kids are kind of listening. And I went to the fourth classroom and I walked in, and the kid's looking at his cell phone, and he said, what time are we shutting down? The kids were way ahead of where we were. And I learned that when my daughter was a student. I would come home, I'd call the news stations and say, start texting folks. And we didn't have a system in place for another 2 years. So how we reach people, how they consume their media is completely different. So I think this is going to be a really interesting project and conversation for me to start and for Mike to finish.
So I agree that Andrew's been very valuable and is much needed. Did you talk about the cost for 1 year compared to where it was this current year for part-time?
we have an increase. I have some details. I have a draft contract that I need to look at. There will be a slight increase, but we'll try to keep it as cost effective as we can in terms of limiting the number of days, so he'll only be on our campus on the days we need. You know, in the middle of the summer, while this summer we need him as he's shifting the website over, next summer maybe not quite as much. So it really is to take a look at the school year. And the other thing to consider
is we measure school time in years. So there's the cycle of the communications package at the beginning of the school year and then how we close out. So this gives us a chance, or gives, Mr. Broadwater and his team the chance to really track how we're communicating with folks, and how we start to hear back from them. How's this working out with our new communication plan to guide us into the next year? So again, I'm excited about the work.
To speak to the contract a little more that Eileen, I think, was asking about, the contract was on later in the agenda. Is that correct?
Correct.
And we're going to discuss it at the next meeting instead. Is that right?
Right.
So what we have right now is the superintendent's report about communications, and then we'll be moving that contract to the 29th. And I would expect maybe we'd have more answers to those questions then.
We will.
Perfect. Thank you.
Anything else in your report, Mr. Nevin?
That is it, unless you have questions for me.
I do.
Good.
And Brad, this is another subject that you and I have spent a lot of time talking about. In part, I think it may have triggered your May 21st superintendent's report to us, and some data that Mr. Ames created relative to high school busing. A lot of folks don't see this data. It's really just a snapshot, and it's just gives you kind of a hint, I think, about what the situation is objectively. But nevertheless, the data here was compelling. It suggests, for example, if I read this right, that about 25, maybe as high as 28% of the high school population in the past, when we had busing, utilized it. And my guess would be, and you would know this, I think, better than me, and some other members of the board might know it more factually, but I'm going to make an assumption that our percentage of other building populations utilizing bus services would be significantly higher than what we have seen at the high school. I'm inferring that this, call it 25%, would be highly localized to ninth graders, and would be logical, I think, to expect that the utilization is highest at the beginning of the school year and does some trailing off after that, and does some probably significant trailing off as you go into 10th grade and beyond. So and then you look at bus utilization, and I think what looks like maybe less than 50% of the buses are filled when we do this. So it certainly tells a story that I was a logistician for many years, and it tells the story that this is a really rough way to run a trans program. The economics of it are troubling, difficult, but at the same time, I think a number of us have had concerns about the impact of the loss of busing on those in our community that need it the most and perhaps are most at risk. And I think we all keep hoping that there's some magic innovation that could address that population and do it in an economically sustainable way. So again, I appreciate all the conversation that we've had about this, and if you have any thoughts on how we should be looking at this or could be looking at it or other things, I'd really appreciate hearing them.
Well, it's interesting when you take a look at 25% of the population, only 25% of the high school population, as an example, uses transportation. So it is inefficient, by dollars and cents. But if 25% of your students don't make it to school, that's a significant hit on your attendance. When I think about the population, this doesn't impact just those who can't necessarily provide car for their students to ride in for whatever reason, this impacts everybody. Typically what you find is families are incredibly busy. They're working. It's difficult. Mom and dad are both working. It's difficult to get the kids to school. The other thing we run into is just a bottleneck in our high school, as we know. That's been a concern we've had. That's largely been the calls I've received. I will tell you that I don't hear a lot of students necessarily complaining about this because they don't want to ride in the big yellow tubes. But when I hear from parents about the inconvenience and the difficulty of getting kids to school, that really strikes me. I've done some research on this in the past, and it's been difficult to find a solution, but that's been a few years ago. So what I can say to the public, I don't want to make any promises and say to you all, but certainly I'll do all I can with my team to see if we don't have some kind of strategy to provide for transportation for these kids, because I do think it's important. But when you look at the cost of total high school transportation, as I said, financially, it's just really out of whack. Just so you are aware, I may have mentioned this before, the data you received is what's called the October count. And the October count back in the day used to be the day when your enrollment for your seats, for students in seats, that's when that number was set for the purpose of funding. But that's also when transportation is set. Well, enrollment for classrooms, that's changed, that model, but still we have this date in October that's when you assume it's all filtered out. The students that are going to ride are going to ride. So that's where that 25% comes from. And it's largely pretty accurate. You may see it drift off lower later on in the year as freshmen become friends with older kids and ride with them. But I will be investigating and looking some options, keeping you posted along the way, seeing if there's any way we can start to, or find a way to help parents out and students out.
Yeah, I think as you think about that, I'm not, I see the operational inefficiency of trying to provide it in a traditional way. It's an it's a one size fits all kind of solution to a problem. And in the world where you're moving equipment and people around, that's often not the right answer. So I don't know what options might be out there, but I'd love to see great minds trying to see if there is an alternative.
I'll find
where
great
the
minds.
need exists. Where the need exists.
Sure. Agreed.
All right, anything else? Would you be so good as to add just a line under your report about a discussion of busing, a brief discussion of busing, so it shows up in the agenda and in the minutes? That way it'll get a timestamp and people can look for that if they want to. Not seeing anything else. Eileen, did we get all your questions concerning communications? Okay. Not seeing anything else, then I think we move to treasurer's resolutions. Mr. Hawley, do you have a report for us before, or do you want a motion on those items before we have a report?
We could do a motion first and then I can go through each of them.
Okay. It would be appropriate for a motion to approve treasurer items 5.1 to 5.3.
So moved.
Dr. Swetchenow moved and I will second. Now I'll ask Mr. Hawley for a report and then we'll have discussion.
Yep. So the first one that we're looking at is 5.1. It's the payment in lieu of transportation. So if anybody's more interested in that, there is information on the Ohio Department of Education's website. But basically, these are students who do not attend the school district, most likely private schools. And basically the way that the state of Ohio calls it is we have deemed it impractical to transport these particular students. And so when we do that, we are required to offer, I guess you could basically call it a stipend, but it's a payment to these individuals who have actually put in their information. And what we're looking at here, and this is a discussion point that we've had previously, the Ohio Department of Education determines the dollar amount, and what we are currently looking to approve in this particular instance is the minimum. This is what the school district has previously done. I've also reached out to school districts around us, and basically all of them do the minimum as well. So at this present time, we are not looking to change this, and we are going to look at approving the minimum, which is $250. Any questions on that?
You want discussion on this now or just continue on?
I would say if there's questions about particular items, we should do it now.
Well, yeah, okay, so let me, it's not so much a question, but let me make a statement. I had a problem with this. I guess it was the last time we raised it. I had an ambition of trying to really dive into this deep and understand it better and see if I could get more comfortable or push for a change. And I have to admit that we have done a lot of stuff here. We didn't do a lot on this one. We've just had a small amount of time to research this and talk about it, et cetera. So this is one that I didn't get done that I'd hoped to get done. And that leaves me in the same position that sort of the same position as I was before. And that's that, well, at least today, I understand that we settle on a recommended payment rate that's consistent with what we've done in the past and largely consistent with what surrounding a large number of surrounding districts do as well. Unfortunately, I don't find that a compelling reason to do it or to set it at that level. So I'm not going to be able to support this one tonight. And I would hope, in the coming months, we'll be able to find some time to have some discussion and either get me comfortable with it or, get us to look at a different answer on this one. That's just where I'm at on it. So.
I would just say that I did some fast math. I didn't do a lot of research into it, but I did some fast math because I've had the wonderful opportunity of both transporting a grandchild to and from the high school this year. So I figured out what that would cost. I have also transported grandchildren to and from one of the schools that happens to be on this list because they did attend one of those schools for a while. Not my Loveland grandchildren, they're currently in the Forest Hills School, but they weren't at the time. And so I've done the transport. So I did the mileage. I did I used $3 a gallon. I did, some math to figure out what it would cost technically just for the gas. I didn't use the 55 or 58 cents a gallon that the government uses for, but I found a range in there. You'll notice that if you have more than one student, you get paid for both, you get a reimbursement for both students. So you would get double, presumably you don't have to take them in two different cars. I do recognize that not everybody has a car that gets the mileage that my car gets. So I used 30 miles to the gallon. I didn't use my mileage. Which is better than that, but that's my choice of the car I have. Anyway, I came up with a number that was not appreciably under the amount that, or over the amount that is being suggested here with the minimum amount. And I think it would be very difficult to come up with a number that really kind of suits all of the individuals. And so I did try to figure out what this number means. And it would work for me if I was able to help my children out that way. I don't have to transport anymore. My high school kid, but another point of doing that was there are a lot of people who were transporting kids back and forth to the high school this year, and they're not eligible for this because they're in the district and they're not receiving transportation. So that's how I did my figuring. My question with all that information, it doesn't matter to you whether I figured out whether my mileage will work or not. My question to you is, if you do not feel that you can support this particular item, you could request to have it removed from the group of three because we will be voting on the Hamilton County contract and the Warren County contract as well. So if you wished to, if that doesn't make a difference, that's okay too.
Yeah.
But we would need a motion to remove it. Yeah,
that actually would be fine with me because I don't have a problem with the service centers. I've read through that and I'm not concerned about that. I am concerned about this, so I wouldn't want to be voting against the contracts.
So I would need a motion to amend the agenda to move 5.1 to a separate item.
Motion to amend.
I will second.
Thanks. Okay, so that motion, again, would move 5.1 to be voted on separately. We can go ahead and vote on that amendment, and then when we get to the end of the report, we can vote on 5.1 and then on 5.2, 5.3 together. Any questions about the amendment resolution? Mr. Hawley, can we vote on that?
Mr. Doherty,
Yes.
Dr. Swetchnow,
Yes.
Mrs. Washburn,
Yes.
Dr. Lorenz.
Yes. All right. I would suggest we go ahead and talk about the other two contracts, and then we'll vote on the items.
So 5.2 is the Hamilton County ESC contract, and I do apologize if that causes a little bit of confusion, because obviously we've talked about something this evening that when we're talking about communications, that's Hamilton County related as well. This is when we're talking about the contract, these are more of the services for children, and primarily typically special education. So both of the contracts, the Hamilton County and the Warren County ones, are up on board docs at this point. So if people want to review those, the board has seen them previously, but that's more for the public. But so these are fairly large contracts that we outsource to these two ESCs. If this is more probably the people watching, but if you're not familiar with an ESC, it's an educational service center. Most counties in the state of Ohio had them previously. They don't exist in every county at this point, but the ones that we typically utilize and work with are Hamilton County and Warren County. And so the one point that I think is just important when we're looking at both of these contracts, I'll just talk about both of them at the same time, because we don't need to necessarily go into all of the services directly. What's important to understand when we're looking at the Warren County ESC and the Hamilton County ESC contracts is that they are less expensive than they were last year. So we talked about these last year. The one reason that they showed up last year as well is because we had discussed this, one of the levy failures was actually to lessen some of the services that we did actually contract with Warren County and Hamilton County ESC, and actually Hamilton County ESC specifically. What you would typically tend to see when you're looking at these contracts is that if we have similar services, that they would have an increase in cost purely based on just inflationary costs. So healthcare, salaries, things like that. So these are contracts that we look at on a regular basis. We look at them annually to make sure that they're still aligned with the needs of the district. And so what we see in this particular case is that they are roughly about $40,000 less than they were last year. So any questions on those?
This one just stood out to me looking at the EL teacher and the units purchased. How is that just fiscally better for us than having in-house ELL teachers?
Yeah, so I can't necessarily talk to the specific service. What I can talk to is
Well, I guess I was thinking cost of like a salary compared to what we've spent there
Yeah,
per
so-
units purchased.
yeah, I'd have to pull that one up specifically, but it's from what I believe, it's 2.4 units. So
I'm looking at the number of days, and then I divided by 180 or whatever. I mean, we're talking about almost 2.5 teachers there. So we're talking about the days of 2.5 teachers. It's not one teacher for those
Right,
units.
Yeah.
So
And just so I don't have to pull it up, do you have the total dollar amount there?
240.
And that's more what I was getting at. And I think it'd be good for us to know, and anybody who's reviewing this, how many full-time and part-time teachers that would equate to, and what it would look like salary-wise compared to the invoice amount. Like I said, that one just stood out because it's
You're just
high. I
asking.
mean, it's definitely a necessary
Sure.
service. I mean, it's required.
You're
Yeah, so-
asking if this is a cost-efficient way of doing it.
Yes, is it? Yes, thank you. Is it?
Yeah, so I can just talk about the contracts in general. So oftentimes what you see with contracts with ESCs, as we can understand, when it comes to special education and students coming in and out, the services can change fairly dramatically. So I don't know if Brad wanted to talk about that, but I can just talk about in general sense. So when those needs change significantly, when we have individuals in-house, oftentimes it's I'm just going to say from a financial standpoint, it's far more difficult to move on from those costs. There would be people that we would have to either place in another setting or another classroom. That's the benefit of an ESC contract, is that there's far more flexibility. So if we do see students coming in, because I'll try to speak as best I can to special education with my vast knowledge of special education instruction, but these services are pointed towards specific needs. And as we see students coming in and out, the ESC contracts allow us more flexibility to be able to move on from certain costs. When you're talking about just the total cost in general, so let's say those are 2.4 units or 2.4 teachers. I know oftentimes it can be somewhat difficult to find a part-time teacher, but then also if you divide it out, it's $100,000 per person. Not to bring up our salary schedule in general, but if you are looking at somebody at the bottom right, we're already at $99,000 just salary wise. So there is the potential that it could have significant cost savings, because when we're looking at benefits, you're adding anything from 17 to 20 to 25% on top of that. So there could be cost savings as well.
The other concern in many populations, including this one, is if you're dealing with transient families as an example, which happens at times, if you take a look, if you have students move in, then you take a look and say, do we hire another full-time teacher? Do we hire, which is hard to find, hire a half-time teacher? If these students move out at the end of the school year, you're not riffing your own staff member, you just don't contract for those services. But I will say this kind of as a side note, obviously we'll have a new pupil personnel director in position. And one of my charges for that individual is do a complete audit of our services, because it's not uncommon in districts for over a period of years, you rarely take away, but you keep adding, and you have to be pretty strategic in how you handle IEPs and other things, and considering those costs, while obviously you provide the services, but be very, very cognizant of the cost of these services. But in this case, this is one that we'll have to watch very closely, because at the point in time where we're spending that couple years in a row and we think we're going to need that position, then you hire the full-time position. Does that make sense?
Am I correct that the number of units is projected and then it's invoiced as the actual number of units are used?
Sure.
So you're committed to units, but if they're not used, then you don't have to pay for them.
Correct. And
Right.
because they're trying to understand their staffing needs as well.
Yeah.
All right, any other questions?
Any other discussion on those items? If not, then I would suggest that we have a vote, Mr. Hawley, on 5.2 and 5.3. If that's all right with you, if we do that one first.
Dr. Swetchenow,
Yes.
Mrs. Washburn,
Yes.
Mr. Doherty,
Yes.
Dr. Lorenz.
Yes, motion carried. We then have an amended agenda, so we have 5.1 as an item to be voted on by itself. That is the payment in lieu of transportation. And so we need a motion for that, correct?
That's right.
And I'll move that we what do I call that? That we approve payment in lieu of transportation.
I'll second.
Okay, any further discussion on that or questions?
Just one quick note, and John Ames went through this much better than I can. The reason that this occurred was that the expense that we were encountering to transfer a very small number of children on routes well outside the district to private schools was tremendous. And I remember on the order of several $100,000 of savings. I may be incorrect, but it was a good amount of money. I understand Kevin's concern, but I also feel my highest obligation is to the students of our school district, followed by the students of other school districts, followed by the residents of the community as a whole. And the reason that I bring that up is that one of the ways that these routes were picked for not being renewed was interest from the families of the children who were going to those schools. And that process, I believe, is happening again around now. So I really wanted to say this so that families of children who are traveling to schools outside the district are aware that they need to express their interest to us around now through surveys that they should have received from Loveland.
Yeah, just so I'm clear, Eric, my objection, if you will, isn't about the practice of eliminating the option. It's the reimbursement or the payment rate that I have a concern with. That's it.
In addition, those routes, there's a legal procedure that you need to follow to determine those routes. They have to be declared impracticable. So you have to show the amount of time and the amount of distance for a route. So that's how they get determined.
Well, and importantly, the number of people using it.
Yeah. All right, Mr. Hawley, can we vote on that?
Dr. Swiftman,
Yes.
Mrs. Washburn,
Yes.
Dr. LaBrowns,
Yes.
Mr. Doherty,
No.
Motion carried. We still have more discussion topics because we like to discuss things. So we have a couple of things coming up here. Actually, our agenda shows, I think the agenda still shows 6.1, 6.2, and 6.3, but I think we're just going to have the 2 on there. Is that correct? The 6.1, which is the potential investment strategy, and then 6.3, the treasure search notion. So the investment strategy, who's in charge of that discussion? Mr. Hawley, Mr. Doherty?
We're gonna tag team this. I'm gonna do the light lifting. Kevin's gonna do the heavy lifting. This is gonna be a very brief discussion. Nevertheless, it's just intended to introduce a topic of merit for further discussion. I think we'll suggest that we pick it up at the June 29th meeting with a presentation from this municipal investment firm that Kevin introduced me to the other day. I think we're in a financial situation kind of all of a sudden where we've got investable, or at least we have the potential of investable cash for a period of time and some strategy to try to make those dollars work for the district. So with that, Kevin, maybe you take it away.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, so the investment company that Kevin and I spoke with is called Meter. It's actually a company that I've utilized in the past at a previous district. And it is actually a company that I have engaged over my time here in the district. As Mr. Doherty basically said very well, was the fact that we at times had some cash concerns within the district. I would say a far different interest rate environment. I'm sure a lot of people see that. In the past, when I've engaged with them, I wouldn't say we necessarily saw the opportunity as well as we might at this particular point. So if people have been paying attention, we've seen our cash balance increase a little bit this last year, and we were seeing healthier cash balance than we have previously. A little bit of an aside, it's been a lot of work. I know it's easy to say on this side that it's been a lot of hard work and it's been a lot of fruitful work, but at the same time, I understand that when you say healthier cash balance, it is something that potentially impacted people's lives. We don't take that lightly. But there's been a lot of work that's been done in the district, and so we're seeing a much better economic. We're basically seeing better cash in the district than we have previously. So we spoke with Meter. Mr. Doherty was on that call with me, and they discussed some of the strategies. If you're interested in investment strategies for school districts, you can actually look at our policy. It's policy 6144. It outlines how school districts are able to invest their funds. One of the, I won't say common misconceptions, but I would say a potential misconception is that schools can invest just like any individual, but we unfortunately are not able to. You may say that's unfortunate, you might say that's fortunate. Depends on your perspective. But what schools are allowed to do based on law it's far more conservative investing. It's far more, it's much more like a bond portfolio if you're thinking about that, invest in your own investment accounts. So what Meter provides for us is the ability to continue to look at the account, to continue to strategize as best as possible, to look for opportunities within the market. That my background is in investments. Obviously, I'm no longer going to be within district here shortly. But despite that, there's a lot that goes on with my job, and they're looking at this on a regular basis. So where we have primarily put most of our cash currently, we do have some investments that have been purchased previously, but where most of our cash has been is, it's not necessarily a money market, but it works similarly to a money market. It's called Star Ohio. It's about 0.10%, or in the investment world, 10 basis points. When we looked at Meter, what they would do is they do a ladder strategy. So they're trying to minimize interest rate risk as much as possible. So if you do your own ladder strategy, we're not allowed to invest in anything over 5 years. And that tells you how conservative the law is. A ladder strategy is basically trying to do 20%. That's simple ladder strategy, 20% in each year. So what they're looking at is, what are some of the opportunities out there? Is commercial paper better than CDs? Those kind of thoughts. So we have discussed this with them. Again, we'll have them put together a presentation for the 29th with the potential of doing a contract with them. And I think that's really most of the information I have at this particular point. I'm not sure if you have anything, Kevin.
Yeah, Kevin, just maybe it's worth pointing out to the board that we're told that Meter is the second largest firm of this type in the municipal investment portfolio management world. So it's kind of a specialized area. They're very big, and they do a number of the municipal investment portfolios in the state of Ohio. I don't remember the number, but there's a significant number. And this is a kind of a mainstream activity for them. It's a very different thing than most of us are used to in terms of our own retirement accounts or what you might think of as an investment portfolio, because the law requirements around this restrict you to things that are equivalent to U.S. Treasuries. And the yield is phenomenally, unbearably low. But if you have enough cash, the basis points, I mean, we're talking about less than a percentage point. Generally, when we're talking basis points, if you have enough cash and you're able to let it sit for enough time, it turns into some reasonable money. In our case, we could be talking about maybe net in the $40,000 a year income world. And that's versus what, maybe 8,000 or something that we earn on that cash today. So it's not the end of the world, but it helps. Every opportunity that we can get to bring some non-taxpayer revenue into the district has the potential for being a good thing. So I thank Kevin for the connection to Meter and following through on this, and we'll have something more to talk about in a few weeks, I think.
Yeah, and so we saw an opportunity because of what our financial outlooks looks like at this present time. And even kind of going back to Meter. So when we talk about Star Ohio, that's offered through the Ohio Treasurer's Department. Meter actually, they actually handle Star Ohio. So they have a lot of credibility within the state. When I looked into doing this at my previous district, they came highly recommended, and I really value a lot of the relationships and the networking I've been able to create over the years, because Meter is present in Southwest Ohio, but far more present, I would say, in the Columbus area. So I reached out to some of my colleagues just to see what their experience was, and they've always had they've had a really, really good experience with them. So if you have any other questions about it, please let me know.
I would just add that when we first joined, this was one of the things that we talked about, and And it's amazing to me in your persistence and diligence at keeping your eyes on it, and literally shaking the couch cushions for quarters is important. You know, $40,000 is $40,000
each year.
All right, if not, we will have a discussion on that June 29th. At this point, then we would move to the proposal from CF Educational Solutions regarding treasure search. Mr. Doherty, are you going to help us? I see Mr. Summers has joined our meeting.
Right. So just a very, very brief introduction. I brought a stage prop with me. And all of you have one of these, whether it's in one place or not, I have no idea. But this is the paperwork that was accumulated during hiring our new superintendent. Not a small amount of effort. So when we think about trying to replace Kevin, our treasurer, I, for one, thought it made sense to invite the firm that we worked with previously in to get their thoughts on how they would approach the prospect of finding and hiring a new treasurer for the district, because this taught me how much work is involved, how much complexity is actually involved if you're going to do it right. So I would look forward to Bob Summers, if you could take over at this point and tell us how you guys would approach this issue.
So, Kevin, the first thing I'd like to do is renegotiate my contract. I think we were too cheap for that volume of paper. The cost per page was pretty low on that. So anyway, good to see all of you. What I'd like to do is, first of all, say thank you for the opportunity to propose that we do the treasurer search. It seems incredibly logical given that both of the searches, while they're different in our mind, and I'll outline the difference, there are some commonalities that you don't have to repeat. There's stuff that you've already done for the superintendent search that's only 3 months old. And we'll go through that. So basically, we see treasurer searches as a little bit different, and so we'll walk through that. As I indicated, we have a number of what we call search prep. And Kevin, I wondered, does everybody have a copy of the proposal?
Yes.
Okay. So I just pass through all of the preliminary stuff and go to the part that I think it's on page 6, that is search preparation and community engagement. Fundamentally, most of the work in that section is already done. We have the key information documents, so we can help the treasurer, incoming treasurer talent, know exactly where your district is, what's going on in that district. You have your aspiration statements already established. So a lot of the work that would typically be done in advance, so we can eliminate all the time and the money involved in getting those sorts of things done. We do have the task of an ideal candidate profile, which you did for the superintendent, only it's a little quicker process in this case. We view treasurers as 4 big buckets, depending on which part of the exercise that you want to look at. Certainly treasurers, CFOs are critically important to the school district, but there's 4 broad categories of skill sets, and we put them in terms of, and this is not unique to us, Deloitte and Touche and a few others have kind of reinforced the same thing, but we see them as steward, operator, strategist, or catalyst. And so if you think in those 4 terms, so do you want a CFO that works to protect assets, ensure compliance, balance books, communicate value and risk, and avoid risk issues? That's a steward. All treasurers have to have skills in that area to avoid problems, but some are particularly prone to work really hard in that area. The second is an operator. Obviously, a CFO office has efficiencies and effectiveness that can occur. There's staff to manage, there's resources to manage. You just talked about investments. And so the operator is a person that would work really hard at making efficient and effective financial processes and smooth operations. Strategist, and I've experienced treasurers in all these categories. I would say that the one that I had at Butler Tech, Ed Pecora, was particularly good as a strategist. They have a seat at the strategic planning table and influence the future of the school. Their ability to help identify vision, understand the vision, and align resources and allocate resources effectively is a very important task. And then the last one is Catalyst, where the CFO actually takes an active role in trying to improve and drive execution of change in the finance functions to help the school district become more efficient and cost effective. So as you think about if you have us do this search, those are the four broad categories that we would build questions around, we'd build skill sets around, and we'd help you identify your ideal candidate profile. No treasurer anywhere is exceptionally good at all four of those areas. They all have their strengths and the areas that they have to make sure they have things covered. So once we get to that ideal candidate profile, and by the way, I would suggest that we continue with the CAG or a modified version of the CAG because your community concerns involve finances. And so having a community engagement group would make perfect sense. You might want to take a look at the one we already had. They've worked together very well and helped you pick your superintendent, but you might want to make some slight modifications if you found some that are more interested in the superintendent than the treasurer. Obviously, your commission members are going to be highly motivated to work in this area since they've been studying finances quite a bit. So once the ideal candidate profile is set, we then would go about the business of defining talent. And this is where we recommend that you depart from the typical superintendent search. We would suggest that we do a digital distribution of the position being available, much like we did for the superintendent. And as you'll recall, we had a very large number of people apply and we narrowed that down quickly. We think we can get that same accomplished with the treasurer. We'll contact ESCs and Treasurers Association. We do have two strong links on our team that are directly tied to the network of treasurers in Ohio in particular. So we would bring that to the table. One of them, by the way, suggested there isn't a talent pool, there's a talent thimble. So we know that we're going to have to work really hard to find quality candidates. And what we would do is similar to what we did with the superintendent search. We would vet them for all the technical kinds of issues, see their alignment to what your ideal candidate profile is. And we would propose that we would bring you 3 to 4 candidates for interview and fit. So the question is not whether they'd be technically competent. We would do our vetting on that. You could have some confidence in that area, what you're looking for as a team member, so that the CAG and you and the new superintendent, Mike Broadwater, would feel comfortable working with the person you chose. If you found a good fit in those first 3 to 4, you'd hire them. If you didn't, we'd do that cycle again, try to find another 3 to 4 candidates that might be a better fit for you. At the end of the day, we streamline the process, speed it up a little bit. We honor the reality that the treasurer talent isn't as interested in lots of meetings and engagements that the superintendents are more prone to expect. But we also bring you about the potential equivalent of the 8 candidates that you actually had for superintendent search. We do recommend that you use the CAG as a process, only we would do much more live and in-person meetings. Obviously, no masks tonight is an indication that we can move processes forward in person a little bit more. And that kind of overview is where we are. The board would hire the potential candidate. We've got a proposal. we put a price tag on it that basically is the same as the superintendent search, only less the time and effort that we already have invested in the preparation. And I'd entertain any questions or comments.
Bob, maybe you'd want to highlight the timeline. Maybe you'd
Yes.
like to advise on the concept of an interim, and maybe you could just specify the cost so everybody's aware of that. And then there
Yes.
may be other questions from the board. Pardon me, I have to switch back and forth so we don't get feedback here.
No, thank you, Kevin. We are recommending, and of course, remember, we're the consulting group that doesn't want to come up short on anything. So we're going to put on a good timeline. We worry a little bit about the month of July. If you'll notice, we don't have much going on in the month of July other than a potential candidate identification, because a lot of vacations occur during that time. And so we're worried that we may have some gaps in people's availability, but we would say if you started immediately that we could reasonably expect to be done by August 30th. Will we get done ahead of that? Maybe. You could cut about a week off of that, week and a half, if you pick out of those first 4 candidates, 3 to 4 candidates. But I would caution you not to shortchange the process and have hope. This is probably worst case scenario would be that you would have a final board approval and contract signed by August 30th. The total price, we basically are looking for a price of right at $9,000 with the same expense. In fact, we didn't spend 10% on expenses on the superintendent search. So something far less than 10%.
Okay, other questions or comments?
If you could just speak a little bit to what you think about the timeline as far as treasurers are concerned. I think the board will have to talk about when they can foresee adding meetings to the schedule. We've added a lot of meetings to our schedule. So I'm curious about the timeline. In other words, you gave us what you think would be your ability to get it done perhaps by the end of August. What would be the danger, or what is the situation for hiring a treasurer either in August? I mean, the year ends at a certain point, the fiscal year ends at a certain point. Is there a danger in going past August 30th? How do you see that working as far as hiring a treasurer in?
So there's 2 schools of thought. Everybody worries that you got to get everything done and be done by May, and otherwise there's no candidates left. I'm always remind everybody to call up your colleagues at Xenia City Schools who never hire their superintendent until September, October, November. They've found that their best candidates are available during that time. So at the end of the day, most talent is fluid. We have contracts, but there's very few school districts that would simply refuse to let somebody go if they really want to make a shift. Some of the talent that you're going to find, and we're testing the waters right now, some of the talent you're going to find are people that have had prominent positions in larger treasurer's office or in the private sector, have grown in the amount of financial management that they've been responsible for. So they may be entering the marketplace. So those things are agnostic to calendars at all. As far as the treasurer duties, probably your biggest period of time, and Kevin, I'd defer to you, but most of my experience has been the big challenge is the end of the year and the first month after that. It's June and July is the crazy period of time, unless you're in audits, and those are always interesting.
Yeah, I mean, I would say the summer, June, July, and then getting ready for the school year, so early August as well.
Yeah. So coming to a hiring August 30th or later would actually be an ideal time. Either the interim or Kevin would have already gotten slug through all the transitions of closing out the end of the year books, getting the other ones starting, getting purchase orders in place, getting contracts and everything in place for the new year.
Other questions or comments from the board? Bob, is there anything else you'd like to add before we close this part of the agenda up?
Other than best wishes, regardless of what you decide, we'd be happy to work with you. I have to admit, last week I felt like I needed to go down to the unemployment office. I didn't have anything to do with all those meetings not being on my schedule. Only kidding. We've been staying busy. I would point out that this process has a much less impact on your meeting schedule than what the superintendent was. One of the advantages you have, you really have the one meeting you're having right now, an ideal candidate meeting that we could probably hold at a regular board meeting. And then in best case scenario, one more meeting of interviews and away you go. So it's a lot cleaner process for you.
I think when I counted up meetings last time, there was something in excess of 25 meetings on the superintendent process. So something less than that, I'm sure, would be welcome for everybody around here.
Yeah, that one won't be, that's pretty high. That's pretty low bar to try to get over. I think we can do better than that.
Okay, Bob, with that, I think we'll just thank you. We're going to have some discussion, and we'll see where we head down the road with this shortly.
And all the best to all of you. It's a pleasure working with you.
Thank you.
Thank you. All right, any other discussion concerning that proposal? Any questions that you came up with that we want to talk about or consider it later? We're not making a decision right now, but if you need information, we can get it. All right, then I would say we are finished with our discussion items. If you look at our agenda, what we have on the agenda is a proposed executive session. I will note for those in the audience that if you look at our agenda, you will see that there are items on the agenda after executive session. So this is not a case where we would say we'll go into executive session and there will be no business conducted. When we come back, there will be at least a Director of Human Resources item to handle when we come back, possibly contract with CF. So there are items to handle after executive session. But we will be putting the meeting on pause while we go into executive session. We will come back for those items and then we will adjourn the meeting in public session. Unless there's anything else at this point, I would ask for a motion to enter into executive session to consider the employment, promotion, or compensation of a public employee and to review negotiations with employees concerning compensation or other terms and conditions of their employment. Mrs. Washburn moved. Is there a second?
I can second.
Dr. Swetchenow seconded. Again, that is employment, et cetera, of a public employee and negotiations with employees. Mr. Hawley, can we vote on that?
Mrs. Washburn?
Here you go.
Yes.
Mr. Doherty?
Yes.
Dr. LaBrown?
Yes,
Dr. Swetchenow?
Yes.
motion carried. I have us going into executive session at 7:53 p.m.
I'm in. Thanks, Kevin.
Mr. Doherty says we are live. We are out of executive session at 9:50 p.m. We do have action items to consider after executive session. And so the first action item is a motion to approve the resolutions of the Director of Human Resources, including resignations and employment of certified classified homebound substitute and supplemental positions for the 2021 summer and the 2021 school year, or the 2021-2022 school year?
You asking?
I'm asking. Are those for next year?
Yes,
Then they're the 2021-2022, right?
correct.
I can't say that very well. So that motion would be to approve those items that are under the HR Director's report. Is there a motion?
So
So
moved.
Second.
So Mrs. Washburn moved and Mr. Doherty seconded. Those items are attached in the agenda. Mr. Ogden, do you have any further report from us? You have a extensive analysis of what's in there, but
The only thing I would like to say is that I want to thank all of the principals and the interview committees this spring up to this point. They've done an amazing job interviewing candidates. We had a great crop of teachers and that went through the process. And once again, I do feel Loveland has a cream of the crop crew coming through for next year. One of the things that we were going to hope to do actually at the 29th board meeting is honor all of our retirees, because if you remember with quarantine, normally we would have had some form of honoring at the end of the 1920 school year. And then with COVID too, we had a number of, which is not typical in the school year, but a couple of retirements right before the school year for the 2021 school year. We had a couple of mid-year retirements, and it's a real milestone in your career when obviously you work somewhere 30 plus years and you go out, and we haven't had the proper notification. So we are going to do our best, still considering COVID, to have some videos and some slideshows on the 29th. We have a piecemeal of 2 years of retirements essentially that we want to do our very best to honor them. So looking forward to that on the 29th.
okay. Any questions or comments about the HR resolution? We should note that it does include the resignation of our treasurer, Mr. Hawley. That's not a normal HR report, but that is included in there.
Yeah, so I think as we give thanks to everybody that has provided service to the district and has retired or left us for any number of reasons, we shouldn't miss the opportunity to say thank you, Kevin. I know it's not always been an easy ride, but you've demonstrated real serious competence in some of the most technical areas of managing this business. And we've always been able to trust you and depend on you, and wish you the best of luck in your new assignment. Okay.
Thank you. Anything else? We could say more June 29th. You'll still be here for the June 29th meeting. Kevin will be with us through the end of July. So, all right. Any other discussion? Mr. Hawley, can we vote on that?
Mr. Doherty?
Yes.
Dr. Lawrence?
Yes, reluctantly.
Dr. Sweshanow?
I abstain. Yes.
Mrs. Washburn?
I abstain. Yes.
That motion carried. And the reluctantly that we expressed is for the resignation of Mr. Hawley. We're not reluctant about the other things that we're doing there, employing folks, making some changes in the administration, we're doing some things that are needed for the summer. So we're not reluctant about that. We're very happy to be able to do those personnel items. So I appreciate that. That motion carried. The other item on the agenda is to approve a contract with CF Educational Solutions for the treasurer search.
So moved.
Mr. Doherty moved. I'll second that motion. Any questions or discussion? For those who are still with us at the meeting, there was a presentation. And I'm assuming that we can get that information onto the agenda now that it's been approved. I don't think it was attached to the agenda, but I think we can get some
I
of
think
it.
that's true. Kevin, do you have that, or do I need to send that to you? I'll send that to you. So I'd like to just speak for a quick second in favor of this. I think that, as we've considered what the future is likely to look like over the next couple of months, complexity of managing all the moving parts of it, the timing, summertime, et cetera, the likely need for an interim, et cetera, just so many different things. Plus the fact that CF is a known entity to us. They've demonstrated their competency in the recruitment process, maybe light with respect to treasurers, but I believe that they have reached out to deepen their connections with this community, the treasurer community, I mean. And I think that they're the fastest, most reliable, and cost-efficient option available to us. So I would urge us to consider this favorably.
I would just note, if we do post that up onto board docs as part of the agenda, I believe that what they proposed to us included a timeline, and I'm not sure that the timeline is going to be exactly what they proposed, as they did for our superintendent search. That changed somewhat. I would like to ask Mrs. Washburn if, just as Mr. Doherty served as the point person with CF in the superintendent search, ask Mrs. Washburn if she would be willing to serve as the sort of point person for the board, the liaison with CF.
Gladly.
All right. Any other discussion, questions, comments? Seeing none, Mr. Hawley, can we vote on that?
Dr. Lorenz,
Yes.
Dr. Swetchnow,
Yes.
Mrs. Washburn,
Yes.
Mr. Doherty.
Yes.
Motion carried. I don't know how we're going to do an adjournment without Ms. Pettit. She always wants to be first to move to adjourn, but
So moved.
we do have Dr. Swetchnow moving to adjourn. Is there a second? Nobody wants to go home. Mrs. Washburn raised her hand. Mr. Hawley, can we vote on adjourning?
Dr. Swetchnow,
Yes.
Mrs. Washburn,
Yes.
Mr. Doherty,
Yes.
Dr. Lorenz.
Yes. Motion carried. I have us adjourned at 9:58. Thank you all.